They told me a shadow-wraith had no soul. They said it was nothing but hunger wrapped in darkness. A thing that existed only to consume light, warmth, hope, and finally you. They said if you looked into its eyes too long, you would start to forget your own name, forget your own face, forget everything you ever loved until all that was left was the cold. They said mercy was weakness, that some creatures were born just to die, and the kindest thing you could do was let them. I used to believe that. I was good at believing things that made cruelty feel reasonable. Then one night, under a sky bleeding red from a lunar eclipse, I found it, collapsed in the black moss at the edge of the iron woods. A creature made entirely of shadow, and it was bleeding silver. Bright, impossible silver, pouring out of its chest like light trying to escape a dying star. I should have walked away. Every single rule I had ever been taught told me to walk away. But then it looked up at me. No face, no mouth, just two pale points of light where eyes should be. And in those lights I saw something that no monster should ever be able to show you. It was begging, not to be saved, not to be healed, just to not die alone in the dark with no one watching. I know that feeling. I have known it my whole life. So I made a choice. The kind of choice that rewrites everything that comes after it. The kind they sharpen blades for. If those words just reached inside your chest and grabbed something, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe to at GatelordX right now, new dark fantasy stories every single week. Hit the like button, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs a story that actually means something. Now let's go. Elara did not choose this life. It chose her when she was 6 years old and accidentally pulled the grief out of a dying woman's chest with her bare hands. The village elders called it a gift. They smiled when they said it. The kind of smile that means, we have found someone useful. She was a sin-eater. The last one in the eastern provinces, maybe the last one alive anywhere. When someone in the village did something terrible, beat their children, stole from the poor, let someone die through cowardice rather than cruelty, they came to Elara. She would press her glowing violet hands against the guilty person's chest. She would pull the darkness out like poison from a wound. And then that darkness, those sins, those ugly hidden truths, would write themselves across her skin in scars. Permanent ones, deep ones, ones that ached when it rained. She had so many now that her arms looked like cracked earth after a drought. The villagers never thanked her. They left food sometimes. Never warm, never enough. Like you might toss scraps to a stray dog you needed but did not want to touch. They spoke about her in low voices. They crossed the street when she walked through town. They let their children stare but pulled them back if they got too close, like her condition might be catching. 3 months ago, after she refused to eat the sins of the Inquisitor's local lieutenant, a man whose crimes were so black they made her hands bleed before she even pressed them to his skin, they voted her out. Banished. No hearing. No appeal. And just a crowd of familiar faces turned deliberately cold, and a road that led only one direction. Into the iron woods. She had built a life inside a hollowed-out oak since then. She collected rainwater. She ate what the forest offered. She slept surrounded by the sound of wind through iron-grey branches that never grew leaves, in a wood where the birds had all learned to be quiet. She told herself she preferred it. Solitude. Silence. No one to need anything from her. She was so tired of her own lies. The lunar eclipse began just after midnight. Elara was awake. She was always awake at midnight, that being the hour when other people's old sins tended to itch the worst. Sitting at the entrance of her hollow with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the moon turn the colour of a bruise. That is when she heard it. It's not a growl, not a scream. Something worse than both. A sound like wind that had learned to suffer. A low, broken, rhythmic wheeze that did not belong to any animals she had ever heard in these woods. And she had heard many. She followed it without deciding to. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. 10 steps past the ring of black moss she had come to think of as her yard. She found it. A shadow-wraith. She recognized it from the descriptions, the absolute darkness of its form, the way it seemed to drink the light around it rather than reflect it, collapsed against the roots of a dead iron tree. It was large, larger than she expected. Its body had no solid edges, just a suggestion of a shape that shifted when she moved, like it was made of smoke that had forgotten how to drift. And it was bleeding silver, not a little, still pouring, soaking into the black moss beneath it and vanishing instantly, as if the ground was drinking it. 3 wounds in its chest, shaped like something had reached inside and tried to pull its light out by the root. The wraith's head turned toward her. No face. Just 2 points of white light, cold as distant stars, flickering now like candles in a hard wind. Elara's entire body told her to run. Her hands had already started to glow. Some habits are deeper than fear. She knelt in the mud, pressing her knees into cold, wet earth, and she leaned forward and she looked into those dying lights, and she said, out loud, to no one, to herself, to the silent woods, "All right, I've got you." The darkness inside the wraith was nothing like human sin. When Elara pulled the guilt out of a murderer, or the cruelty out of a corrupt elder, it felt like reaching into thick mud, unpleasant, heavy, but familiar. Something made by human hands, and therefore something her human hands could hold. This was different. This darkness was ancient. She could feel centuries in it, cold, compressed, layered over itself like scar tissue over scar tissue over scar tissue. It was not evil exactly. It was more like grief that had been alone so long it had forgotten what it was grieving for. Pain that had calcified into something harder and darker than its original shape. She pulled the first shard free and gasped. Immediately 3 new scars opened across her left forearm, not slowly, not with a gradual burn. Instantly, like they had always been there, and her skin had only just remembered them. The pain was white and total, and she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose until it settled into something she could carry. She pulled the second shard. Her vision split in 2 for a moment, the world doubling and swimming, and she had to grip the wraith's shoulder to stay upright. It made a sound, that broken wind sound, lower now, almost like a word in a language that predated language itself. She kept going. She told herself what she always told herself in these moments. This is your purpose. This is the only thing you are good for. Do the work, and do not complain about the cost. But here is the thing about lies you have told yourself for 20 years. Sometimes, in the middle of the most honest moments, they crack open and you see what is actually underneath. What was underneath was not purpose. It was fear. Fear that if she stopped being useful, she would stop being allowed to exist. She pulled the third shard free and collapsed forward over the wraith's chest, her whole body shaking, her arms on fire, her vision tunneling at the edges. The wraith was still. The silver bleeding had slowed. Elara pressed her forehead to the cold, dark mass of its shoulder and focused on breathing. She had not done this for purpose. She had done it because something that was suffering deserved to have someone try. Maybe that was a distinction that did not matter. Maybe it was the only distinction that had ever mattered. She was still deciding when exhaustion pulled her under. She woke to the sound of the wraith breathing. Not the broken wheeze from the night before. Something slower, steadier. The deep, even rhythm of a creature that had stepped back from the edge of dying and was now simply resting on the other side of it. Elara sat up carefully. Every muscle in her body had an opinion about that decision. Her arms were mapped with new scars from wrist to shoulder. She did not count them. She had stopped counting years ago. And the hollow felt colder than usual, or maybe she was just more aware of cold now. The wraith was watching her. Those 2 pale lights, steadier than they had been the night before, aimed directly at her face. There was something different in them now, not just the flickering desperation of a creature trying to survive, something more focused, something that felt uncomfortably like attention. Then it spoke, not words. She needed to be clear about that, even in her own memory of it. It did not speak in any language that had ever been written down or taught. It was more like sound that carried meaning the way a piece of music can make you feel grief or joy without a single word. Vibrations that landed somewhere below her ears and above her understanding and somehow resolved themselves into sense. Why are you doing this? Elara was quiet for a moment. Because no one did it for me, she said finally. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, scraped raw from disuse. I know what it feels like to be something people think it is acceptable to let die. And I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to be the person I needed when I was small and frightened and completely alone, I would take it. Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just wide. Then the wraith moved, slowly, carefully, as though afraid to startle her. It reached out one formless dark hand and rested it, barely touching, barely there, against the worst scar on her wrist, the deep jagged one she kept covered even when she slept. The first sin she ever ate, the one that had never stopped aching. Under its touch just for a moment it went quiet, not healed, not erased, just quiet. Elara had not known how loud it always was until it was not. She did not know when she started crying. She only noticed when she felt the tears cold on her cheeks and realized they had been there for some time. The third day was the closest thing to peace Elara had felt in years. The wraith was nearly healed, or whatever the shadow equivalent of healed looked like. It moved now, which it had not done before, drifting slowly around the interior of her hollow with a kind of careful curiosity that she found unexpectedly charming. It bumped into her water collection bowl and then went very still, as if waiting to see what she would do about that. She righted it without comment. It seemed satisfied with this answer. She started talking because the silence felt different with it in the room. Not empty anymore, full of something she did not have a word for. She told it about the first sin she ever ate, 9 years old. The village elder, who had been abusing his household servants for years. They had come to her mother who had the same gift, and had passed it on, along with nothing else before disappearing entirely. And her mother had been too sick to perform the rite. So they had looked at small, and terrified Elara and said, "You'll do." She told it how the scars had horrified her at first, how she had screamed the first time she saw them, how over years she had reframed them, told herself they were armor, told herself they were proof of survival, told herself the weight of them meant she was strong. She told it how she was not sure anymore if that story was true or just necessary. The wraith listened to all of it, every word. It did not shift uncomfortably. It did not try to offer solutions or change the subject or make the silence about its own feelings. It simply remained present, those pale lights steady and warm, and aimed at her like she was the only thing in the room worth paying attention to. She could not remember the last time anyone had listened to her like that. The villagers who came to her came for what she could do, not for who she was. They did not want to know her. Knowing her would make what they were asking her to do too uncomfortable. This creature, this thing that her entire world had told her was soulless and dangerous and worthy only of destruction, was giving her more genuine attention and care than any human being had offered her in 20 years. She understood then that she was in serious trouble. Not because it was dangerous, because it was not, and she was starting to need it. She woke on the 4th morning knowing before she opened her eyes. The temperature was wrong. The hollow had a particular quality to its warmth when the wraith was in it. Not heat, exactly, but a kind of weight to the air, a presence that she had stopped noticing because she had already gotten used to it without realizing she was doing so. Now the air was just air, thin and cold and indifferent. She opened her eyes anyway. The hollow was exactly as she had left it the night before, with one absolute and total difference. She was the only living thing in it. The black moss where the wraith had rested was dry and undisturbed. The small stones it had apparently been arranging into patterns near the entrance. She had pretended not to notice this because noticing it would have made it mean something, were scattered as if by a sudden wind. There was no silver light, no low sound of breathing, no pale eyes watching her wake up with that steady, unafraid attention that had become the thing she looked for first every morning. Just absence. Elara sat with the absence for a very long time. She was good at absence. She had lived inside it for years. She knew how to let it settle into the background, how to keep her hands busy, how to make the hours move without feeling each individual minute of the emptiness. But her hands would not stop shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees and breathed and told herself all the true things. It had healed. It had left because it was well enough to leave. This was the outcome she had been working toward. She was a sin-eater. She gave things comfort and then she let them go. That was the shape of her life, and she had made her peace with that shape years ago. Except she had not, and she had just been too lonely to notice. She had made a mistake much worse than breaking the law. She had let the law stop mattering to her. She had started without permission and without planning to want something simply because it made her feel like a person instead of a function. And now it was gone, and she was still here. And the hollow felt like an accusation. The hounds came at midday when the iron-grey light was at its flattest and the woods were completely silent. She heard them a long time before she saw them. That was by design. The High Inquisitor's tracking hounds were bred to give their quarry just enough time to know they were coming, just enough time to feel the specific quality of dread that comes from hearing your end approach and being entirely unable to stop it. It was a psychological technique dressed up as a hunting method. Elara recognized it immediately because she had spent her whole life on the receiving end of techniques like it. She stepped out of her hollow and stood in the clearing and waited with her arms at her sides because running would have been both pointless and beneath her dignity. The Inquisitor emerged from the tree line on a black horse that moved with the eerie silence of something trained for intimidation. He was exactly as she remembered him from the one time their paths had crossed in the village. Tall, pale, assembled in the way that people who have spent their whole lives performing authority become assembled. Every element of his appearance arranged to communicate power and the absolute expectation of compliance. White robes, never stained, never rumpled. She had thought about those robes more than once during her months in the woods. Clean robes meant you stayed far enough from the suffering that none of it reached you. They were not a symbol of purity. They were a symbol of distance. He had 12 guards in black iron armor, and they fanned out around the clearing with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before. She had a hollow tree and 2 hands that were still shaking slightly if she thought about the morning. Elara of no house, no village, and no gods. His voice was designed to carry, deep and deliberate, the voice of a man who had never once had to raise it to be obeyed. You stand charged with deliberate consorting with a creature of pure darkness and corrupted shadow. You have broken the oldest law of this province. You have endangered every living soul within 30 miles. He paused. Let the charges settle. You will surrender yourself. You will come quietly. Or, and here the pause was different, architectural. You will not come at all. Elara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the wraith's hands resting on her worst scar and making it go quiet. She stood up straight. She looked the Inquisitor directly in his ash-coloured eyes, and she did not move a single inch toward him. They tied her hands and walked her back to the village square with the hounds at her heels and the guards' iron armour ringing against the silence of the iron woods like a proclamation. The villagers were already assembled. Or she did not know if the Inquisitor had sent word ahead or if word had simply travelled the way word travels in small places, by some instinct that bad events develop for finding an audience. She recognised faces, the butcher whose sins she had eaten twice, the merchant who had cried with what she now understood was relief, not gratitude, the morning after she took his guilt and gave him back his clean conscience. The elder's widow who had come to her in secret and then denied knowing her name at the banishment vote. They watched her walk through with the particular careful blankness of people trying not to feel something they are feeling very loudly. The Inquisitor's speech was long. She let it wash over her, picking out the key words: corruption, contamination, willful violation, soul death, and hearing in each one not a description of her crime, but a description of his fear. He was afraid of what happened when boundaries dissolved. He was afraid of empathy that did not respect the lines he had drawn. He was afraid specifically of people like her deciding for themselves what deserved mercy. Then he offered her the chance to renounce it. Standard procedure: deny the act, beg forgiveness, accept rehabilitation. She looked at him for a long, considered moment. "That creature," she said, and her voice was steady, which surprised her, "never once asked me for anything I wasn't willing to give. It never lied to me about what it was or what it needed. It never made me feel that my only worth was in the suffering I could absorb on someone else's behalf." She turned to face the assembled crowd. "I have eaten the sins of every family in this square. I know what lives behind every one of your clean doors. I have carried your cruelties in my body for 20 years, and I am standing here telling you with absolute conviction. That creature, that shadow, that thing you would burn me for touching was more honest, more present, and more genuinely kind than anyone standing in this square has ever been to me." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the Iron Woods kind, heavier, more human. The Inquisitor raised his blade. The sky cracked open into darkness, and the darkness had a shape. The shadow came from everywhere at once and from nowhere in particular. It moved the way water moves when a dam gives way, not attacking, not striking, just arriving, filling every available space with a speed and totality that made resistance feel beside the point. It poured from the canopy above, rose from the seams between cobblestones, unfolded from the spaces between heartbeats where fear lives. The Inquisitor's blade did not break from impact. It simply ceased to be a weapon. One moment it was raised and the next it was falling in pieces, as if it had considered its purpose and decided that purpose no longer applied. The 12 guards in their iron armour did not advance. They did not retreat either. They stood very still, which was perhaps the most honest response available to them. The shadow gathered itself in the centre of the square between Elara and the crowd, and it rose and it solidified, and then it did the thing she had watched from the opposite direction once before. In reverse, it became. The darkness did not disappear. It pulled inward, concentrated, restructured, and what emerged from it was a man. Tall, dark-haired, wearing clothing that had once been royal and was now simply old, the deep black and silver of a house she recognized from the crests on ancient buildings, threadbare from what looked like years of transformation and curse weight, his hands. She looked at his hands first because she looked at everyone's hands first. They were marked, long pale lines from wrist to elbow, in patterns that were disturbingly, unmistakably similar to hers. She looked up. He had eyes the colour of starlight filtered through winter clouds, cold and pale and extremely, carefully alive. "My name," he said. And his voice was rough with the particular roughness of someone who had not used it in human form for a very long time. "Is Valerius, eldest son of the House of Aldrin, rightful heir to the sovereignty of this kingdom." He looked at the Inquisitor, who had gone the colour of old wax. "The man you follow cursed me 3 years ago when I moved to legislate the end of the sin-eating practice. He needed it to continue. He needed a permanent underclass of people carrying the guilt of the powerful so the powerful could keep acting without consequence. He needed people like her to stay small enough and tired enough and isolated enough that they would never ask why they were the ones paying for everyone else's cruelty. He turned away from the Inquisitor then deliberately, the way you turn away from something that no longer merits your full attention. He turned to Elara. She had not moved. She was still standing with her hands bound, her arms aching, her heart doing something loud and complicated in her chest. He crossed the square toward her and stopped close enough that she could see the faint remaining shimmer of silver at the edges of his scars. The Wraith's scars, her healing work, still settling into human skin. He did not touch her. He waited. You did not just heal a wounded creature in the woods, he said quietly. Quietly enough that it was almost only for her, almost a thing said inside the hollow with the rain outside and no one else listening. You ended a cycle that has been running for 100 years. You chose mercy when every law and every lesson said to choose safety. You gave something back its life when the entire world had agreed it was acceptable to let it die. He paused. And you have always deserved to be something more than what they made you carry. Elara looked at her bound hands. She looked at the scars running up her arms. She thought about everything she had been told those scars meant: burden, contamination, proof of her otherness, the visible record of her usefulness, and therefore her continued permission to exist. Then she thought about a formless dark hand resting on the worst of them, making it go quiet, asking for nothing in return. The eclipse broke. Light came through in long gold bars across the cobblestones, the kind of light that arrives after long darkness with the specific quality of something that has been waiting. The scars on her arms did not disappear. She had not expected them to. They were hers. They were the map of everywhere she had been. But in the new light, looking at them with new eyes, she understood for the first time that they were not a sentence. They were a record. They were proof. They were the most honest thing about her, and she was done apologizing for them. The end. If this story found something in you, honor that feeling. Subscribe to @GatelordX right now and join the community that lives for stories like this. Drop a comment below. What hit you hardest? The hollow? The trial? The moment she stopped running? Like this video. Share it. The Iron Woods have more stories waiting, and so does she. Story by @GatelordX.